In my paper, I'm going to try to answer a question I've had since the beginning of the semester. Is there a value in the concept of enlightenment outside of a spiritual awakening or religious context? And is it something based in logic? So, my paper, A Modern Assessment of Zhuangzi Buddhist Thought and Enlightenment by Tyler Sims, will be trying to answer those questions. So, the way I've decided to format the PowerPoint will be the same way we're formatting the essay: topic, thesis, main argument, objection, rebuttal, conclusion. So, for the topic, when you remove the religious aspect from the idea of enlightenment, are you left with a valuable school of thought? If so, is there a logic to be learned from enlightenment, from perspective and suffering that Zhuangzi the Buddhist taught? And if so to that, does it still hold value in the modern West? And I particularly ask this question because Eastern thought has always been very different than Western thought and vice versa. Um, Obviously, many people have observed that. But the question is is this just a spiritual belief? Or is this a set of logic that you could apply to daily life and should maybe be pushed to anyone to learn, not just philosophers or people who are interested in spiritual learning? So my thesis is enlightenment is seen in these two books. While it involves a spiritual awakening, it also involves a logical realization that differs from Western thought. This logical realization adds value in a modern world as it transcends traditional ideas of the West. I I definitely think when we see the Buddha awaken, for example, one of the things is he claims to know the ending of suffering, but the way he ends suffering, he kind of approaches it with a very logical framework, similar to how Zhuangzi, while he takes on many perspectives, also has some logic to denouncing certain frameworks of the mind, like very rigid frameworks. And so I think they both have a logical side to that awakening. So for my main arguments, the Zonga way of thinking escapes social norms that most people fall into because of being trapped in one perspective. It also finds itself quick to adapt. Being willing to take many perspectives is also being willing to know when you're wrong and right. You know, his ability to find anything as sacred or even something that's useless as valuable shows that it's a very challenging mindset where you're challenging your own perspective to constantly change it. And that's an evolving mind, which will be deeply logical. And the Buddhist way of thinking also emphasizes critical thinking, personal experience, and practicality. Definitely in Buddhism, we see that each Buddhist experience is personal, but you're also told to critically analyze what holds value and what actually makes sense for ending suffering. So it has this very practical side to it, which would be rooted in logic. While these ways of thinking do differ from your average Western thought, I do think that these are logical bases for making life decisions. And thus, I think that there's definitely a logic here to be studied and to be applied to your life. Now, for the main objectives I see is when you remove the religious aspect, do you weaken the logical base because it was all justified off of a spiritual religious context? And when you remove it from its time period, do you also weaken its argument? Now, for Buddhism, I think it's pretty timeless, but I can see this argument against it where the teachings in Buddhism are very based off things like samsara and other things to do with karma, and thus has a very heavy religious view. But when you break it down to the view of apply this to my personal life, be critical of it, and then analyze does it have practical value, that's a very logical way to view the world. And I would say it's very abstracted just from Buddhism because it could be applied to many things. So I think there's an underlying logic that's universal there. And for the Zonga way of thinking, it's highly influenced by the time period. From his hate to be involved in the government to a lot of his skepticism, you can see that what's going on in the world during this time period has heavily influenced him, and thus has heavily influenced a lot of the arguments he makes. And our world is not in the same state his was. but also his changing perspectives that encourages this fluid mind, I think is a universal. And it builds this like framework for having a very dynamic way to view the world. And I would say even now it's more practical than it used to be because more people are going to take on more perspectives now and try to have a more dynamic view than in his time period to begin with. So, for my conclusion, when you remove the religious aspect, putting it in a modern framework, both Zhuangzi and Buddhist logic still hold valuable. When brought together, they form a dynamic and critical way to view the world and make decisions, and thus hold as a powerful way to understand our world and the logic you want to use when approaching it. Now, I should have mentioned this in the other part, but I am going to also bring in Nishida during the rebuttal, just because he kind of gets at the whole questions of like, is there logic in the East? How does it compare to Western logic? And, when he looks at things like Zen, he definitely dives into takes on Buddhism from a logical perspective. And I want to bring that into mine just as a kind of way to touch up on the logic and help refute some of the objections against logic. Thank you.